not got any apologies, but Angus, here we are. Thank you. We'll go down the list. No declarations of interest. We are going to have a break at 9:30, which the bell will go and we'll all go outside. Okay?
We're going outside?
I think so.
I don't think so.
Heather, get under the table. Okay. Confirmation of the non-confidential minutes. Ordinary meeting the 30th of August. Do I have a mover? Seconder? Put that to the table. All those in favour, please say aye. The contrary carried. We have the action sheet there, or do you want to deal with the minutes first? Matters arising, if any. Okay, we'll go to that. There are no questions on the matters arising. No discussion. The governance work plan. Any issues there? If not,
currently doesn't have anything on there, I don't think, about working up terms of reference for a AUD plan. So we've got to obviously put in place a committee or structure to research alternative use and disposal in the future. And I think that we should probably be looking at that within our work plan so that we can have a good discussion around it.
okay. I don't have any leaves of absence, no acknowledgement and tributes, no public input and petitions. Extraordinary business. Well, I can say today, I think, this is from a personal perspective, this will be a watershed meeting for us all. Some of the decisions that go forward to council. No notices of motion, no adjourned business. We come to the information reports, the consent review group progress report, 11 to 47. It's open for discussion. Now, you all had the opportunity to read it. I guess you'll want to comment on it. I take it from your silence you don't. Yes, Councillor.
I think perhaps the reason that people are reluctant to speak to it is because it says within the reports enclosed, several of us have been interviewed and made our preferences clear. We were always for the furthering of this as fast as possible and to the best possible outcome that council can achieve. I think that our original recommendation still stands as far as what this committee desires, and that was what we achieved over several years' work. So it's no, I think it's quite clear why people don't want to speak. It's already said in volumes in this report. They don't think that the current approach will meet the consent standards. We didn't think that to begin with as well. So I think that it's only the way forward is for council to see this paper as a whole and make a decision to move forward further and faster, because it's just not going to achieve the goals that we need nor meet the requirements.
Concerns are noted. You want to comment on that, Dave? No? We'll go to page 48. Sorry.
The hesitancy may be about which points do we start. Sorry. It's not that we're unanimously in agreement.
So, Mr. Chair, yeah, a couple of things I'd like to discuss in the report, and that's item 7. So I agree with Shannon. The intent of the report is clear and supportive of the work this committee has done before, as well as WATAG. But I would like to think we can make some recommendations today around some of those points. So firstly, around the removal of mortuary waste, I'd like this committee to pass a recommendation supporting that today, as well as the work of the suggestions on AUD. As Shannon said there, terms of reference are required, but I think we should give it some mandate to start progressing as soon as possible.
Through the chair, the paper in front of us discusses mortuary waste, as does the independent review panel and some of the recommendations that the IRP have made in their draft report. One of the things that we'd like to discuss with the committee is we haven't had a chance to respond to the independent review panel's paper. As agreed with the committee, we've provided that draft straight through to you without having, because as we didn't have time to be able to digest it ourselves, we gave it to you the day that we got it as well. One of the recommendations in there is to move with haste around the removal of mortuary waste from the system, and that comes from the independent review panel, and it's something that the consent review group have also identified as part of this. We would want to bring a paper back to the next meeting in order to cover off the independent review panel's recommendations and how those could be implemented, and we would look and seek the committee to do that at the next meeting around those recommendations for you to make the decisions on for those next steps of those.
I think, Chair, there is an element of, if we go over this paper, it's as if we need to start at the back and come forward, and some of the implications contained in the other reports have bearing on this first report that we're looking at. And it really just boils down to I guess what we see is the transition role at the moment and the various things that the consent review group have fleshed up, and what the independent review group have brought forward. This kind of makes me wonder, where is the future for this group at the moment, WMC?
I think critically important one, and the outcome of some of the resolutions, if any, today go forward to council. But as David has said, staff want the opportunity to come back to us before that happens. I presume that's how it's going to work, David. Is the committee generally in agreement with that? No.
As I'm trying to say, that it seems to be we're addressing another delay, and this whole history of delays is wearing tangata whenua down a bit. The critical point of a group in here that I'm still trying to find the ownership for, the Wastewater Management Options Project Team.
So through the chair, that's an internal team that's progressing the consent through at the moment.
And it seems to be a critical team that will develop this report for the meeting of the 15th of November.
Sorry, David, who is in there? Who's in that team?
Kia ora. So that is the project team. It's myself and Dave as sponsor, as well as our internal staff that are involved. For example, the wastewater treatment plant operator and the utilities managers. And we have consultants who are also helping us with the consenting aspects.
Mr. Chair, I'm not opposed to waiting on the report, but I know we're not meeting until next year. So that's after the council meeting. So when's the chance for us to review Dave's report?
Through the chair, the next steps that we've discussed with the consent review group and with this committee is we've taken feedback from the consent review group, who we've reached in position with of where they stand for any consent variation of the process going forward. Given where they stand and the advice that they've given us as outlined in this report, we've brought that to the Wastewater Management Committee and we're taking it to council because some of the recommendations from where the consent review group want us to go are outside the mandate of staff and outside what we're able to do given the direction that we've been set by council through the long-term plan. So this committee is seeing that recommendation from the consent review group as it goes through to council, and it's a for information report as this goes to council. More than happy to take feedback from it from the committee, but we're not at a stage of which ones of things of these that we're going to change and do because we're outside the mandate of us as staff and the direction we have as council. So the fact of where we've got to with the consent review group, we need to take that back to council for them to give us direction on where we're to go next with what we're doing.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson has pointed out that the mortuary waste should be done at haste. I think that it would be fair for this committee to make a recommendation to council to proceed with planning for separation of mortuary waste. I don't think that it needs to come back as a report to this council if we already have identified a preferred option and we've already identified that it needs to be done. It can be sent straight to council to be actioned essentially. And I understand the desire to see this report with a staff summary, but I don't think that's going to change anyone's opinion around here. The report is very clear on its recommendation, so I have no problem with moving or actually I think it was already proposed, but moving a motion to proceed with mortuary waste. Likewise, I think that we need a recommendation to council to move the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant further forward in the annual plan, dependent on when staff believe they can actually get it complete in the fastest timeframe, which we don't have within these reports. We don't have a staff recommendation as to how far forward the timing of that they believe they could achieve. So I think both of those things are the key points here, is that we need to complete the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant sooner, and we need to implement mortuary waste. And those two things don't require a new report as far as I'm concerned. They just need to go to council as recommendations so that council can get on with it.
You prepared to move in that direction? You frame the resolution?
Yeah, I'm totally supportive. This is like the chickens come home to roost. We've had variations and delays on this whole project, since 2014, and it's been put out. And now we've commissioned two different bodies, CRG and the IRP, to come to us and give us recommendation. They are all saying that the chickens come home to roost. This is time to move. And as a committee, we need to support this call. And it's up to council or staff to come back with some budgeting and some financial criteria, I guess, to figure out how we can move this forward and do what the recommendations in here say. So I'm totally supportive, and as a committee, I believe we've been very strong right from the start of where our stance has been, and we should continue to do so.
Staff are currently working through the way in which we can look to move the implementation of disinfection forward as fast as we can. It's not simply a matter of finances, which is a very large component of it. It is also around the timeframes for getting everything in order that needs to happen. And that's a piece of quite complex work about how we move from where we are now to turning the key on for disinfection. And we've got the team working quite hard to make sure that we have the tightest timeframes we can and what's actually feasible from can we actually build it in that timeframe that's been asked to be pulled forward, and what's the reality around lag times for ordering plant and equipment, let alone designs, consents, sign off, all of those things. So we do have a process that we have underway that we're working to try and get that. Then there's also the implications on the long-term plan if we move the sizable amount of money forward 2 years and what that impact that has on the rest of the long-term plan and the costs and what that actually means for us as a community. So we absolutely hear the consent review group and we have taken their feedback back, as you can see in the report. We just need to work through the detail, and it is quite a substantial amount of detail, and then what those implications are for the rest of everything that we have in front of us.
Is that not an issue for council though, not this committee?
Through the chair, that's why we're taking the paper to council.
Sorry, thank you, Ms. Wilson. Yeah, as my recommendation states, I think it should be advances the implementation of clarification and UV treatment to the soonest practical time. And I think that council is going to have to work out when that might be. But from this committee, it's just to reinforce that we should do it as soon as possible. That's all that's within our power, and we already have that information for this committee to make that recommendation.
Any further discussion? Sorry.
Yeah, talking to the content of the paper, I'm not the least bit surprised that they've come back and opposed a variation to the consent. For me, this is about a priority for our city. We're probably unrivaled across New Zealand in terms of a significant essential piece of infrastructure for human health purposes, requiring so many variations and delays. It's actually getting to the point of being quite embarrassing. So yeah, we've had legitimate reasons of why there have been delays, but now I think we've got to the point where we've just got to say this needs to be done. What I really like about this report is it's highlighting the fact that we had a consent with dates in it prior to our long-term plan, and we got out of sync with that resource consent. We knew when we said it, we had to meet this date in the consent, but we still phased it wrong. And this consent is making that really clear. The main point I want to make though is that we're talking about essential infrastructure for our city. This is about human health and this is about ocean health. And we've got to do it. At this stage, we still don't have any protection from pathogens. They're still affecting the ocean and us when we're having discharges. And that's one of the main reasons why I want us to be doing this sooner rather than later. Human health is of fundamental importance.
So, Mr. Chair, through you, yeah, I'd be keen for this committee to give David some feedback on their thoughts around AED working group. So from my perspective, and I think as the report state, there are already groups established to undertake that work. There's a suggestion there that the team needs to be beefed up in certain aspects. I don't oppose that, but I think there's infrastructure already created. And that's currently being led by AIR under the QA group. So I think that's where we should be pointing the direction of that group.
Chair, just on page 16 there under risks, item number 24 there, it talks about the risk that the consent review group cannot reach consensus on some aspects. I take exception to a word in the next part of that sentence. That not all proposed group members agree to contribute. I think the contribution has been quite high by everybody that's present in that group. It's not, there's no threat to not contribute, as that may apply.
Any further discussion? I think the committee will start the clear steer.
Oh, just a question. In accepting this report and the contents of it, does that mean that this committee is accepting those key outcomes from the CRG? And if so, do we need to have further recommendations? because it's just an information report, but if we accept it, does it mean we're accepting the outcomes?
Through the chair, if you were wanting, sorry, if the committee was wanting to accept and endorse the consent review groups, you would be able to draft a new recommendation that you endorse those key outcomes referred to and those bullet points that are there. If that is what the committee would like to do, is endorse those recommendations to council, so that when it goes to council, it would be that the Wastewater Management Committee endorses the outcomes of engagement for CRG. A variation of the consent is opposed. The LTP phasing of implementation is considered unacceptable by the CRG. The consent variation is more likely to be supported. Alternative use and disposal and mortuary waste be removed from the domestic wastewater system. So we would turn those bullet points into the recommendations to council, that you endorse those findings if that's what your committee would like to do, to give more weight to the report rather than to just receive it.
Someone move.
Let's be clear, this is
The next two reports are literally the same thing. But we're all in favour. Righto, let's go to page 48. Before we discuss it, you'll see the recommendations there, but it's fairly in-depth. Would you care to talk to it, Wolfgang?
So as David has said, the IRP has provided us with a report. At the time of writing our paper, we had not reviewed the report, and we passed it on literally the same day as we received it to make sure you had enough time to review it before the meeting. So we will still have a look at it to see what information is in the report, and we're going through that at the moment. We will consider the outcomes in the IRP report as part of an internal consent compliance review that we are doing as council staff. We have to make sure we are complying with the consent, so we will consider those findings with that. Some of the outcomes that we've already touched on are that the IRP recommends that the permit holder prioritizes separation of wastewater from mortuary and funeral home activities from the domestic wastewater. So that's one of the key recommendations. They're also very strong in terms of the AUD program, stating that we now need a holistic integrated approach, and that the AUD program should be progressed in parallel with any work programs for the long-term treatment. So as we upgrade, we need to continue with AUD. They've recommended a quantitative assessment of public health risks, and they have made some suggestions to council for us to seek some legal clarification on some points.
Discussion?
I just want to make a comment about the final paragraph on page 70. Right at the second to last sentence, where it says, under the current situation, it is likely that the suspended solids and pathogen levels at location 4 will exceed the consent conditions after the commissioning of the preferred long-term management option. That's actually not quite correct, and I think I'd like that to be explained a little bit further. What they're actually saying is that council will be complying with the consent. Council's contribution to the final discharge will comply, but the people not complying is actually industry. But when you read that, what it's saying is that this community is going to invest, I don't know, $25 million, and we're still not going to comply, which actually isn't correct. So I'd actually like maybe if that could be highlighted to the authors to say that they need to explain that further, because council will meet its consent requirements. It's when industry joins it that we no longer comply. if that makes sense.
If I may, through the chair, I agree with councillor Dunn. The way that it's worded is quite clumsy. The consent we will meet at point 4, industry, if they do nothing, will not, which will actually tip council back over into non-compliance. As the WMC are aware, the consent brings, once disinfection is installed, it also raises the quality of water that industry is able to dispose of down the pipe as well. So one of the big drivers for industry is once we install disinfection, they also have to meet the same standard for a number of different indicators as at the outfall at the same time. So they all also have to have primary treatment installed before they install into discharge into our wastewater system. Otherwise, we will go over, but it's something we'll take up with the IRP to clarify.
Thank you, Chair. I think that point can be widened to say that the challenge, I believe, made by the independent review panel is that some of those practical implications weren't taken into. So as Councillor Dunn said, it depends on what consent you're talking about. It will be compliant depending on which consent goes forward. And it would look like that we've taken our foot significantly off the ball with a number of little consent changes that are not going to happen under this current, under your current wishes under the LTP, what you put aside for. So I think some of the requests for legal advice is a little bit more than Wolfgang has indicated to us. And I guess tangata whenua feel that the legal advice is very important that will be sought. I'm also assuming by all the material that was provided to the independent panel that legal advice has not been sought by council to date.
So through the chair, if I can just clarify a couple of things there. The consent as it currently stands still retains the requirement for industry to meet our standards once we meet the disinfection standards. So for our big supply discharges, they're very aware that they have to meet some very similar, well, they have to meet the same consent conditions that we do. We've had discussions with the likes of Ovation, who will struggle around enterococci. We've had some conversations with Coxco, Leaderbrand, the others that are discharging with these high levels in there as well. The legal advice that has been asked for or recommended from the IRP, we have started to request that from our legal advisors, particularly on the points that have been raised by the IRP where we should be seeking further legal advice. So we have commissioned that. We're yet to receive anything back, and it will take some time for us to get that back given the volume of material that needs to inform that recommendation.
I think this leads to the fact that that November 15th report will not have that legal advice by then. So once again, we are seeing a report going to council that won't be complete. And I think that it's something that once again we won't see as well if it's brought together in front of council.
Through the chair, my understanding is we'll have the legal advice for council meeting when that goes through. That advice is coming through to the consent holder to tell us around our compliance within. Happy to bring that to another WMC meeting once we've got that through.
Sorry, Chair. The word consent holder, it's good to hear that word used in this environment. And there are two people in the room. Gisborne District Council is a permit holder and a consent holder. And then I also read that the legal advice could ask the consent holder to ask the permit. There is powers with the consent holder. And us in WMC and tangata whenua, we would like to see a lot clearer delineation between the two so that we are comfortable that the consent holder is taking on the appropriate advice and managing the consent conditions without worrying about what's in the LTP. I can't see why the consent holder has got any, it needs to worry about what's in the long-term plan. A consent holder is a consent holder.
If I may, Chair.
Yeah.
Penny, if I'm able to respond, the consent holder in this situation is Community Lifelines. So we are very separate from regulatory. The consent application, the compliance and all of those things are held within another hub completely, and there's very much a wall between us around our compliance with the consent. When it comes to the long-term plan, our input is around what is feasible and what are we able to build, because we'll be required to do that under the long-term plan. The long-term plan, as it goes forward, we inform, and the council just are the ones who are the ultimate where things fit within that and the overall. So we give advice as the consent holder for what we will be able to do and be able to build, as you suggest. And it's around how we are compliant with our consent is something that we are constantly talking with our regulatory side about through our wastewater treatment plant operator, Tracy, and then also with Neville and Wolf around making sure that we're compliant as we move forward. Some of the recommendations from the IRP we've already taken to our consent side to say, this is the recommendation. Are we still moving where we're supposed to be moving? And are you comfortable with the progress that we're making today? So internally, we do see those as very separate functions that the two should not cross. So I just wanted to give that assurance to the committee. So sorry, through the chair, this is the draft report from the IRP. As Councillor Dunn's noted, there's a couple of things in there that we want to clarify and move forward, and there's some others as staff that we want to just make sure that they're aware of some of the nuances from what they have, because this is an important document for us around our recommendations going forward. As staff, we will bring back the final report with how we are looking to implement those steps to the next Wastewater Management Committee meeting once the IRP have signed off the document that is there. So as we said, this was an opportunity to look at the draft. We're comfortable with what's contained, and we think it's a very good and comprehensive report of what's happened over the last few years, and it's brought some things to our attention that we know we need to be bringing back to show you this next steps forward from it. But once we have the final, we'll then bring our next steps forward for you to approve around our work program rolling out for that. So that was the intent of this.
I personally, just because of council process, I personally aren't comfortable with approving recommendations that are included in a draft report that's been provided to council. I'd prefer to wait for a staff response and summary of that, and then approve it later. It's the same recommendations that we've highlighted to council in the previous paper anyway, more or less. So I'm happy with how we're currently moving forward, but I wouldn't support approving things out of a draft paper.
Sorry, through the chair, which council meeting are you referring to?
Where all these reports are going up in November?
So, sorry, to clarify, the report that we have here, the draft from the IRP, will go back. They will then have to give it back to us. We're comfortable and have started looking to implement some of the recommendations that they have made, particularly around the receipt. All of the ones there, we've started to look and see how we can accommodate those ones on page 80 where those recommendations are made from the IRP. For things like the receiving environment, the hydrodynamic modelling of the bay, the pathogens and those things, we have to look to see how we would actually implement those within, so how we would do it basically. So part of that will come back in our recommendations to WMC and councillors around the next steps forward for implementing those recommendations and the timeframes for those, but that won't be by the November 15 date that we will have that.
Chair, Chair, if this is the opportunity to talk to that draft report, I think there are some other aspects that I would hope that David and his team would review as well. And I think some of the issues that are contained in the report, and I think some of us agree with the report in its entirety, and we're just not comfortable that council will see it in its entirety. And then some of the small comments are like when the last time we had an independent panel, and there's got to be some sort of responsibility amongst all of us about the fact that this one was called for at such a late stage. This paper could have been better provided to us at a lot earlier time to have more important input into the LTP.
I note your concerns. I have faith that the staff will do what they've said they're going to do.
Well, there are other aspects too that I think just if it is to be a record going forward, then I think I believe that the report is a little bit underwhelming on the history of what the concessions that Tangata Whenua have made over a long period. It talks about certain concessions of a later stage, but some of our original ones to get us kicking before the BTF aren't, I don't believe, noted. I thought the report was a little bit quiet. There was an opportunity, what we call the Kiwa part of this consent could have perhaps had a little bit more depth in. I noted that there was very little mention of the Māori compass and the impact of that. Some aspects, there's one for Chiaichanga Mahaki. Mahaki believe that they have a environmental plan lodged here with council, and this review panel couldn't find it, and all it found was Ngāraki's environmental plan. I just felt that there were some other areas that could be improved on as well.
Thank you for that. I'm on record saying iwi have been long suffering with regard to tutai and poo into the bay. We hope this time round, I'll stress the word hope this time round, we get it right. But staff have been taking notes and have acknowledged what their responsibility is. That will satisfy iwi.
Thank you.
Okay.
So through the chair, the next steps will take that feedback back to the IRP to ensure that they put more information into the report, if that's the next step you're comfortable with. Penny? Yeah.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Yes, Ronald.
Just to clarify, so David, the IRP report going to council?
Sorry, through the chair, the final report will go through to council. So this is the working draft, and as Penny's outlined, there are a number of things that we need to make sure are put in further yet. This would be something we would refer to in the papers that we put up in November to say the draft report has already included these recommendations, but the final is not with us yet.
Are we good?
Sorry, I'm just concerned of when this committee is going to make recommendations based on their report, and how that will influence council's decisions around potentially bringing forward funding. So that's just my concern, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I'm got a number of concerns around, I get a feeling of Groundhog Day where potentially we're going to get these reports, making these recommendations. We're going to feed them back through a filter of staff to council, and I just hope we don't end up back where we were, several months ago. That's really my concern, is that it's pretty clear and explicit, the recommendations from both the reports, yet we still have a need to take them away, consider them, I'm not sure what for, because that was the function of these reviews, was to reconsider where we got to. And my concern is that in 6 months' time, we're going to find ourselves back on the same day, reconsidering some filtered version of what's been agreed.
Can I give you an assurance, Chairman of this group, Leroy, that there won't be a filtered down copy or report going to council? Staff taken on board most of what's been said this morning. I note them furiously writing. Kimber.
I'm just wondering whether it would be worthwhile to say that we will accept these, we support these interim recommendations, and should there be any major variations from them, that they will be brought back to us? Because I can't see there being major variations on these recommendations between the draft and the final report. So maybe that's a middle ground we could get to and say we support these interim recommendations. And if there are to be any major changes, that we will have an extraordinary meeting for this committee to, perhaps that may be a way forward.
Larry.
Yeah, unfortunately, when it comes to the council table, us as Wastewater Management Committee members are a minority with 4, as opposed to 13 other councillors. So it is, I believe, it is up to staff to really make sure that the recommendations are really strong from this committee to go to council convincingly to try and change the decision that was made originally to bring forward the process, so it's done immediately. So I mean, we've got to be very strong ourselves, which we always are at the committee, at the council table, being members of the Wastewater Management Committee. That is our forefront. That is what we are. That's what we've decided. We've worked with our committee members for the whole time. So our mandate is set, as far as I'm concerned. So it's up to us to try and convince staff to put a really good case forward to council, so we can get the unanimous vote that we need to bring this forward. It is unfortunate that being only a minority, that the task is quite a big one. But
Don't forget,
we need to work on it.
don't forget, councillor, that the long-term plan and the funding allocation is set in concrete, and it will take a level of convincing for council, despite staff having put a report to the contrary to council. It will take a monumental shift to get that changed. Councillor.
Thank you. I'd absolutely disagree with that statement that it's set in concrete. Nothing is set in concrete, and we are governance, and we should be able to, and we should be adaptable and flexible, and we should be meeting the needs of our community. And it's been highlighted in here that that we're not meeting those needs. We're not meeting the community desire. We're not meeting the desire of iwi and tangata whenua. We're not meeting the desire of the Wastewater Management Committee. We're not meeting the recommendations of the of 2 independent review panels to argue that our funding is locked up because of an arbitrary document that we legislated to write. It doesn't mean that we don't have the ability to change that. We should be changing to make sure that the best outcomes happen for our community. As it stands, we've been incredibly fortunate with provincial growth fund funding. which should see massive improvements across our roading network, which we couldn't rely on before. And our long-term plan was heavily in favour of roading improvements at the ratepayers' expense. And that was a big driving force for the way we sequenced the events. Also the change in budget for the stormwater bank, the floodwater banks has been has made that require a lot more thought as to how that fits within the long-term plan, because we're talking about a quantum of money that wasn't really allocated for anyway. So we need to, so the long-term plan needs a review regardless, because of the major investment we've had, and prioritization within that can be changed to best results for the community. I absolutely support what Councillor Dunn put forward, that we support these interim recommendations, and I'm glad to hear that we have your assurance that the long suffering of the iwi has been recognised, and that this time we will make the right decision.
I'll attempt to respond in a positive manner. You have to remember there is only 4 of us sitting amongst 13, which includes the mayor. The long-term plan is a document that was worked through for a fair while. I don't say it can't be changed, but it will take a monumental amount of persuasion by staff to turn the other councillors around too. Never mind all the publicity. Yeah. Okay, take your point. Anything further?
Mr. Chair, I just absolutely support what Shannon said, and just remind ourselves that we actually got a consent that we're legally obligated to deliver. So what's set in concrete? Right. So, and I support Amber's recommendations on interim recommendations as well.
So the wording I have, Councillor Dunn, is the WMC endorses the interim recommendations of the independent review panel.
And if there is any changes to it, then we will be updated.
CEO wants to make a comment on this. Nadine?
Well, it's probably, through the chair, it was probably in reference in terms of the long-term plan and the process that needs to be undertaken should council support any recommendations by way of bringing funding forward. So it's not just a matter of let's go ahead and review and change the plan. The plan is based on statutory requirements in terms of consultation and amendments and audits that all follow from that. So if the council were to change the current position, that requires a long-term plan amendment, that then requires special consultative procedure, which means we have to go back out to public. It's all subject to that same process that we went through before. That's not saying it's not achievable, but it is a mammoth task to also do that and take some time to get that done. And we would, depending on where this falls, we would either run it along an annual plan process, or we would do it as an ad hoc consultation item proposing an amendment to their long-term plan. So it is, there are a bit of hoops to jump through in order to get there. So it's not just as simple as a mere change. It will take some time to work through.
Point of clarification, would that require consultation for simply shifting the priority order? Even if we're not changing the intent of any of the items within the long-term plan, it's only changing the dates that they will occur?
Yep, so on this particular one, what you're in effect doing is, because of the way that we've modelled the finances, if you bring, say, $20 million forward, you're then going to impact the year when interest will hit. So, and according to our finance team, rough estimations will be about 4% increase in rates in the 2 years where we have not budgeted for that, where that debt would have occurred. So what we have been in anticipation and thinking, well, this is where the committee is going, looking at what other funding options that would mean that there would be no impact on rates if we were to look at another way of debt funding. earlier. So it's a bit of a process to work through. It still would require consultation because you're substantively changing your financial strategy and your long-term projections. But yeah.
No further delays.
Yes, Chair. I think the consent review group, in its commentary, there is a way forward in that commentary. And I can hear what the CE is saying. And I think it's all a matter of transition, as Shannon is saying. And tangata whenua will need to see some actual transition. And I think this constantly putting the LTP up in front of us as a wall just makes doing further reports meaningless. I don't know how your leadership are going, how our leadership, sorry, not yours, ours, are going to address this. But certainly in the groups that I've participated in, we've constantly felt a difficulty with swaying council as a whole. It's one of the tangata whenua noted, I think we may be the envy of a lot of places and the level of engagement and participation that are afforded to it by this council. But it ain't meant much, unfortunately. There's been no prizes for attendance and participation. And that's a difficult part for tangata whenua with the reports that are commissioned. All the cards are stacked in council's favour, the ability to write these reports, the ability to move parts of reports in this way and that way. The LTP was just too hard for us to clamber against. Working on people's guilt and fat shaming them with the amount of fish and chips they would lose if they voted for this proposal, or if you gave up smoking, you would be able to afford this proposal. There was no way we could get ahead of that publicity campaign that won awards all over the place. So it's, let's say, it's one constant battle after another.
I can understand the frustration, but I can also give you an assurance. You at the table are highly valued, and your opinion and requests are highly valued. So don't lose faith.
Maybe you, for our representation, there'll be less councillors at the table, and a party like this would have more influence. Four would mean a lot more at the council table.
Recommendation? Second? Put that to the table. All those in favour, please say aye. The contrary, carried. Page 153.
Just to talk about this paper, as I mentioned earlier on, we are having an internal consent compliance review. So as the consent holder, we need to make sure we are complying. We have to date focused on the purely operational matters. So, yeah, are we meeting discharge standards, etc.? We haven't focused on the aspects that the IRP has been reviewing, so we can use their information to inform how we report on that compliance. In terms of our review, and I just said this is an interim sort of report because we're still waiting to look at the IRP information before we look at the other conditions. But in terms of what we have looked at, we have found that we have had some reporting non-compliances, but and that's in terms of producing annual reports. We have had a lot of reporting, but not strictly annual reports, and so that's one area we have identified we need to do better at. There was not an IRP appointed in 2012. We have had some non-compliances in terms of suspended solids and oil and grease. And then in terms of whole effluent toxicity testing, there have been instances of non-compliance. It appears those are mostly linked to the testing protocols, and we're investigating those to figure out if that is the case. We're also looking at whether or not the domestic or industrial waste stream is causing those non-compliances, if indeed it is not the method. And that's really where we've got to. We will be continuing with the internal consent compliance review, using the information from the independent review panel, and we'll report on the final outcomes to WMC at that subsequent meeting.
More just a comment. One thing I would have liked to have read in this report, and maybe it's just too early because you've begun it, is that there is a whole series of conditions in the consent that don't kick in until we put in UV disinfection. And it's actually a really critical part of the consent. It would have been really nice to have read that in here. So for example, into Kokai, limit doesn't kick in until you have installed UV, which is one of the reasons why we need to install it. So it's part of our story of the importance of UV.
I absolutely support that, and it's why we always get the false assumption that we're meeting all of our consent conditions. We're not meeting all of the consent conditions which we will require. We're only meeting the current, which is an interim allowable limit. We need to provide all parties with the full scope of what is expected to be released. Otherwise, yeah, we always have to battle that same argument of us meeting those consent conditions. And likewise, I think this, and I've heard Councillor Dunn mention this in the past, and it's around the monitoring for plumes and the camera surveillance during the daytime, and obviously we purge the system at nighttime. So when that greatest outflow happens, yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is there any potential to using an IR camera for evening monitoring around times of that discharge?
Through the chair, can I just get Tracy, who's our wastewater treatment plant operator, to clarify around the plumes and when they're cleared?
So the flows into the wastewater treatment plant, the majority of it comes during the day, so there's no storing of any wastewater there. We don't have the capacity, so whatever comes. So we have actually got a diurnal flow that comes through the plant. So we have our most that's around about that sort of 9 to 11 in the morning, and then another little peaks between sort of that 3 o'clock when kids goes home and about 7 o'clock at night. So that is all generally during your daylight hours. Winter's a little bit different. Industry, most of that is actually during the day as well. We actually have low flows at night. So that nighttime plume, we don't have any flushing or anything that happens at night.
We're talking about the flushing of the BTF, the daily flushing of it to clear out the biofilm.
So that currently is actually happening during the day.
That is correct.
That's correct.
That's excellent, thank you.
Just questions to all about pages 166 and 167 on the general review clause 26 and 25. So you say there that, well, clause 26, there are some general review clauses there, but no general reviews have been undertaken. Do we intend to see that those reviews are undertaken?
Penny, I'll defer to.
Oh, it's a cooker. Yes.
No, that's good, because I know the commentary once again, it just leaves it a bit vague and it doesn't sort of give me any assurance that those reviews will be followed up.
So through the chair, one of the things we intend to do is put those general reviews on the governance work plan so that you will see when those are coming back through to the committee. So one of the things that the team have been tasked with is taking all of the review clauses that sit within the consent, and there are a number that were hidden in there that we needed to have pulled out, including your WMC annual review, to actually put that into the governance work plan so you can see when those are coming up, including we'll put in when those need to be started, so the initial kickoff for those, and then when those reviews are due back in as well.
Yes, thank you, Chair. That was my first comment I made, is that that general review is important because that'll help WMC work out where it lies with this transition. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like a bit of conversation or some clarity. In clause 38 on page 171, we're talking about the BTF and the sampling, and the sampling was required until 2012. In 2011 and 2012, we were non-compliant with this level, having over 3 samples over the limit in 26 consecutive samples. We have continued the monitoring to better inform the consent process for the future. Since 2012, we were above the limit in 2013 and in 2014, and then again in 2018, when we were almost just above the limit. What is almost just above the limit? And is there going to be a time when we are compliant?
So through the chair, Tracy, we're talking about clause 38, and it's around the suspended solids and total oil and grease. Since 2012, we're above the limit in 13 and 14, and then again in 2018, we're also just above this limit. Can you just outline why we were and what are the steps to get it back under?
So that is compliance of the industry. And so so initially industry were non-compliant, so they were putting through too many suspended solids. So we've since done a bit of a change in the way that we deal with industry. So instead of being a policeman effect and checking to see if they're compliant, we're making them show us that they're compliance. So we're asking them to provide waste management plans so that they're actually changing the way that they function, so that they've got plans in place when things do go wrong and that they're self-checking. 2018 was just a bit of an unfortunate year. We'd had 2 different industries that had had a blip, if you like, and they had come through. And so it just meant that we were just over that limit for that year. But generally, it's been much improved over the last few years. Compliant at the moment, yep.
My fellow councillors, thank you for your diligence, and to iwi, long-suffering you may be, but thank you for your patience, and to our staff in particular and our management, thank you for the hard work you've done in getting us to this stage. I know one of the issues for me is that ultimately, hopefully we get this resolved. And if I can just comment without being negative, Drainwise has been with us a long time. Given the effluent stuff that gets into the river, we've got to resolve both the wastewater one and Drainwise. So with no further business at hand, Penny, will you close our meeting for us? Thank you. Amen. It's a cup of tea over there.